Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. I'm so thrilled today to be talking about the wonderful movie, The Outside Story, with writer and director Casimir Nozkowski. And the first thing that I want to talk about is you create this story that starts off as a very intimate, central portrayal of the main character, Charles, played by Brian Tyree Henry.
Mhm.
And then it really starts to expand as the film goes on, and you add multiple characters to it. You also really expand upon the themes that the film is exploring in a much wider context. And so when you were writing the script and first thinking about the development of story, what was that journey of beginning with the intimacy of this character and then finding how you wanted the evolution to flow out story-wise?
Right. I think, with this, Charles, and Brian Tyree Henry, I mean, Brian is the movie. Charles is the movie. He's in every shot. He's in every scene. So, it really, when I was writing this film, it was really thinking about Charles as the center, as obviously the most important piece. And then honestly, once Charles was kind of like created in my mind, I was just having so much fun thinking of, well, what would be the most interesting people to be orbiting him and to kind of like bump into him and crash into him. And it's really like, I love working with actors. It's honestly probably my favorite part of directing, maybe my favorite part of filmmaking. I love seeing it come to life and the way actors kind of think about their character and make the character 3, 4, 5 dimensional. But I think in this case, I was really excited because I was like, oh, locked out, stuck on the street, meeting his neighbors. It's like such a good excuse for like all my favorite actors to just kind of come like running in, vignette, like a little vignette, have a little moment, and wanting everything to pay off. That's the other part, making it kind of work as a puzzle, how it gets solved, how Charles's problems get solved to a degree. But really, it was a pleasure once I really had Charles in focus to just like see this like beautiful landscape, one block, but how to make it feel like an odyssey populated by like the most interesting but hopefully authentic characters I could come up with. So you're just throwing stuff at the wall. The widow, the piano prodigy. What else have I got? The circus performer. No, that's too crazy. Okay. So it's really fun to write like that, where you have the framework and you're just throwing them in there until it really feels right.
And you end up at a point where there's over 20 characters that have speaking roles beyond him in the film. And yet you manage to use them all in a way where they're adding dimension either to their own character story or in support of Charles as the central character. So when you're writing something that is maybe just a 2 or 3-hander scene, that's going to be the only moment where we meet that character and we have to learn everything about them in just a few seconds. How do you approach mapping that out and making sure that they all feel dimensional when they come onto screen?
Oh my God, it's way harder than you think it's going to be, because you're trying to make the movie fun. So a lot of times, like, I mean, for me, a lot of it and meaningful. So you want it to kind of check off those boxes. Is it meaningful for him to meet a woman who's over 9 months pregnant, who's 2 weeks late to deliver her child? Like, seems interesting, seems fun. But you're right. Like, they're only going to be on screen for a couple of minutes. And the worst thing in a movie like this is too much exposition. Oh, well, I'm really upset about being pregnant because you see, my husband is, you don't, it's like, how do you make it feel authentic? How do you make it make sense also that he would meet these characters? So you have to think about it like they can't all just be neighbors. One of them has to be a parking cop. One of them has to be an antagonist from this block. So again, you have the block, you have the framework. Who walks on this framework in the course of a given day? That would be interesting to talk to. And so obviously neighbors are going to be an important part, ones that are right under his nose in his building. But then there's also got to be these other characters that come from like almost like a different angle. So I think it was just, again, it was fun. And it would be these little eureka moments where you're like, oh, a parking cop. Everyone hates parking cops. How do I met? And then that becomes a challenge. So everyone hates parking cops. She's an antagonist. But on the other hand, wouldn't it be interesting just to explore like her vulnerability? Is there something there? I think that was the key thing for all of these characters. What's the overlap with Charles? What's the thing about them that's going to make Charles be like notice them, and like, oh, you've got problems like I've got problems. Oh, you're suffering like I'm suffering. Oh, you're happy. And so it's just trying to come up with these, the more you kind of think of Charles in this really three-dimensional way, it becomes easier and easier to unlock the characters who show up, because you're thinking really, like, does this work with Charles? Would this interest Charles? Would this make sense to Charles, who is sort of a stand-in for the audience too, I think. So I guess that was some of my approach to it anyway.
And in working with all of those actors as well, it's always so important, especially if someone's coming in just for one scene, that everybody's in the same film performance wise, and everybody knows, okay, this is the world that we're in. This is the tone of the movie. And
Right.
particularly given that you didn't actually have time to have rehearsals and you filmed it in 3 weeks. So there wasn't even the opportunity to rehearse a scene right before you filmed it. How
Yeah.
did you set about working with the cast and making sure that they were all bringing in the right tone of performance to match everything else that you've been filming with Brian?
Right. That's I think I can here's what I would say about it. It's really comes down to working with the best actors. It is about working with the best actors. So actually the majority of the work you're doing, in my limited experience here, but I think I'm just literally I'm cribbing from the Robert Altman playbook here, which is, you do most of the work in casting. And that if you cast the right actors who are like, oh, 16 days to shoot this film, great, no problem. Who are game for that? Oh, no rehearsal, great, no worries. And who are just kind of vibrant, charismatic, likable, like interesting people, as well as super talented actors, you are pretty much 90% of the way there. Honestly, it's like you're going to work stuff out on set. And we talked about things. We got into it. We discussed some motivations. We had some really polite, delightful arguments with, would he still be wearing that sweater here? But that's the fun part. That's the best part, when everyone starts to really care about the character, the actors, the director, the crew, that everyone starts to care about these. So you actually start to feel like you're supported on so many sides. Yes, of course, we could have made a wrong move here and a tonally, like, tone deaf thing here. But like, when everyone's like rooting for these actors, you actually kind of feel like, well, whichever way this conversation works out, it's going to be cool. Like Brian Tyree Henry is such an amazing, wonderful actor. The fact that he's here saying these lines, I am pretty much all the way home. And my job as director is really just don't mess it up. Don't get in the way. Don't be distracting. Don't, I'd say the one thing, hope maybe that I contributed is to actually not be precious about the script, to be really like open to the idea of improv, to expanding the lines, to holding takes a little longer. Keep in mind, because it's 16 days, we're only getting 2 or 3 takes per shot. And in that case, I found myself a lot of times, the scene would be finished and I would just let it hang and see if anything else kind of popped up, a look, a line, a funny moment, a great exit. And I probably pushed that boundary a lot, because that's where you sometimes find like some of the most interesting things. So I guess to sum it up, it's just, how can you create space for actors to be comfortable, and how can you not mess it up, and how can you not be precious? Like, it would be so bad if in 16 days you're like, oh, there's actually a the before that in that line. So if you could just hit that the worst, that would be the worst. So in my opinion.
And obviously, looking at Brian Tyree Henry's performance throughout the film, and the fact that, as you mentioned, he's in every single shot throughout the entire movie, how did you approach the way that you wanted to capture him on film, and as the narrative evolves, how you wanted to shift the way that we're looking at him through the lens of the camera with a lot of your stylistic choices?
We talked a lot before we made the film about like shooting him in a way where he was in the beginning kind of isolated in frames. So there wasn't a lot of over the shoulder. It was really like portraits of people kind of talking. And I think we did that to a degree. I think there is some things like that. We did that for a while, but I had a lot of the conversation that really like I think of a lot is one I had with Brian about likability and about how to make Charles likable, because, he's a depressed character. He's kind of complaining. He's kind of, he's down. Nothing's going to work out. How do you make that, not a turnoff for the audience? And I don't know that that was something that in writing it, I had really considered. A lot of times I think for writers, I'll just say for me as a writer, you kind of get hung up on the math of a story and you're like, well, does this mathematically work out? By page 32, he's starting to question his choices. By 50, not that bad, hopefully, but like you're thinking about, does it kind of stack up as a character arc? And by that logic, then the first 30 pages, he's just like, total grumbler. And that's, who wants to watch that? That's not super fun. And Brian was so instrumental in being like, this guy can be depressed, but he can also be excited to see his friend who brings him keys. He can be kind of like, amused by the ice cream truck passing, whatever it is, there's all these ways to make him really compelling. And I thought about that. We talked about it early first couple of days. And I thought about that. The whole film was that actually was like a key thing. So stylistically, yes, we were thinking of ways to kind of bring him closer to people by the end. But honestly, I just was like, I'm actually going to flip it and I'm going to follow Brian's lead here. And if Brian says like the guiding light of this scene is that I'm going to be excited about such and such small thing happening, then I'm not going to worry about whether, where's that shoulder? Is he alone enough? And so really likability was, I don't know if I would call that like stylistic, but it was definitely like a guiding principle for the film. And I'm glad we did that.
I find that really interesting because, especially looking at the fact that, like you said, he is a character who's suffering from depression, and one of the struggles that he's having is really just stepping outside of his apartment and making space for the world in his life.
Mhm.
And we meet him at the point where that's already the case, but you also narratively manage to explore, how did he get to this place, even though we're not seeing that journey on screen.
Mhm.
So what was the process of figuring out how to bring that backstory into the film without being able to show it on camera specifically?
It was actually kind of hard. I mean, that goes back to the thing about, you have limited time with these characters. So how can you learn as much as possible, as much as you need to learn about them without having it be overt or cheesy or, again, expository to a fault? And in this case, I knew who Charles was. I knew he was this filmmaker, this guy who was working on a documentary or maybe multiple documentaries, and it hadn't worked out, because I think that, again, just personal note, that's like my greatest fear as a filmmaker. It is intimidating how long you work on a feature project, documentary, narrative, whatever. It can be years and years. And as someone who's made lots of short films that you kind of knock out really quickly, it was really scary to me you're going to give 4 years to a film, 3 years to a film, whatever. And God forbid it doesn't happen. You do those 3 years and then it just falls apart, as so many projects do. Anyway, that was my own personal take. And then, so for Charles's character, I wanted that worst nightmare to have taken place. He worked on something for 4 years. We know it's a documentary. We don't know exactly what it is. We don't want to because there's no need to get into the weeds. It's just that there was a project that was so important that it actually sort of broke his spirit. And that kind of was a tumbling down that can happen for anyone, where you just get really, it's hard to try again. And it's hard to try again in your career. And then that leaks into all the other parts of your life. It's hard to try again in a relationship. It's hard to try again in, I don't know, what you're cooking that night. And so I think with that, I just kept thinking about, how much can I sprinkle in of that background? I guess to sum it up, I think you need to know the character, and then you can try a lot of things, both in the script and in the shooting. And then as an editor, you're just really trying to, what's the minimum amount that's needed? Because I think talking about you want to show history, but I don't think you want to talk too much about history in general, because it's a very telling, not showing thing. So in that case, I think that's what know the character really well. And then what's the minimum amount you can get out there before people start to go roll their eyes, all right, yeah, we get it, and one other thing, there's a thing that I don't even know if I've really internalized yet, is that the audience is so much smarter than you probably think when you're setting out. Or you think oh, I've got to lay out the whole thing, or people be like, what, huh? Why is he depressed? I don't get it. And in fact, audiences want you to succeed, right? So they're watching it and they're going, oh, yeah, I get it. Filmmaker didn't work out. Cool. I think you have to actually rely on your audience probably a lot more than I was thinking originally. And by the end of this process, I think going forward, I will do that more with future projects.
And you also have that added detail that his day job and how he pays his bills is editing in memoriam videos for people who haven't passed away in anticipation of having that ready in case it happens.
Right.
And I think what's so great about that detail is it's not just an exposition and a throwaway of like, this is a guy and this is his job. That actually tells us a huge amount about his mental state. The fact that he has to sit there and think about that every day in a really in-depth way, very differently to the rest of us. And so that kind of leads into his mental state as well. And I was really fascinated in learning that that's also a job that you yourself have done. And so how did you really want to bring in that detail and carve it beyond, again, just like being that piece of exposition and really make it a central piece of his emotional fabric?
Totally. When I did that job, when I used to make commercials and promos for TV channels. And so one of the tasks I was given was, hey, this is at the channel AMC, and they used to do classic movies and regular movies. And one of the tasks was updating in memoriam videos, like you're saying. I remember being kind of like shocked, like, wait, this is a job? People do this? Like Clint Eastwood hasn't passed away yet. What do we do? What is this video I'm making? And it's really, you realize like when someone passes away and you see the obituary in the Times 5 minutes later, or it plays on TCM 20 minutes after the announcement, and you realize that these videos are constantly being updated and the obituaries are constantly being kind of added to. And naive person that I was, I didn't know that. And when I did it, I remember being like, wow, this is so grim. This is like the grimmest thing. Like, what would people like to see when such and such actor passes away? And I remember thinking when I did that, oh, this would be a great job for a really depressed character. This would be like the best job for someone who can't fix their own life, but they can obsess over someone else's life. And yes, they're a celebrity. Yes, they're a kind of major star they're obsessing over. But I guess, I wanted it to hint at the fact that he's like, no, I've got to get these in memoriams like really beautiful. And I want to really, capture this person's wonderful life. And at the same time, that seemed ironic for someone who's kind of like letting their life just kind of fall apart. So I think, it was fun to show. And I think the only thing that was a challenge, one of the only things that was a challenge there was, showing anyone who works on a computer in a film, and trying to make that dynamic visually is, I think, pretty challenging. I do think editing timelines, I know personal bias as an editor, I do think editing timelines are kind of beautiful to look at, the colors and the lines. And I was trying to make it feel a little abstract and like pleasurable to kind of see that. And also, I love it when you do see a job or a new job in a film that you actually get like a real insight into it, as opposed to just a, random, wait, what is that? What kind of job is that? But that you actually, oh, that's how that works. Oh, cool. So those were all of the factors into making that work for Charles.
I also wanted to talk a little bit about the way in which you build that sense of anxiety and tension. And, there have to be stakes for the character, for the audience to invest and care what happens next. And at the same time, again, just going back to that idea of it being an intimate character portrayal, it has to feel very much in the real world and not like it's being overly embellished. And I think you do a great job at that. It's like being locked out of your apartment, something that we've all experienced or we're nervous about because we know the ramifications and how difficult it would be to get back in. Having a recent breakup, what that does to us day to day, getting a parking ticket when you're at your car at that moment, even if you don't have a car, what that feels like seeing it on screen. And so how did you work to really gradually build that tension and think about what the stakes were going to be and make sure that it still always felt very true to him as a character, but invested us along the way?
Right. I feel like a lot of times with stakes, I feel like I'm sort of bad with stakes in a funny way where I'm, I want everything to happen organically. I want everything to happen. I'm also someone who likes movies where the stakes sometimes aren't the most life and death right off the bat. And you're right. Like they do need to unfold and it does need to pull you in. Like I totally agree with that. But I really loved, I think for me, I kept thinking about, okay, what's the smallest problem that can happen for a character that I haven't seen on film before? And it felt like getting locked out is like the most minor of problems. I mean, maybe it's probably a little greater than other problems, but it's, it's a relatively minor problem. But what it does is it really sets, it sets Charles on this path that he then has to kind of like run through all these other problems. But really, I just kept thinking about what Charles was caring about. So in the beginning of the film, I felt like a lot of it, he's very kind of like self-obsessed. He's very like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to, just, sit here and think about my self-pity. I'm just going to, he's really just thinking about himself. So I think the way I approached like the arc and the stakes was to think about, well, what I want is for Charles to start caring more about the people around him, not necessarily more than him, but just that they're welcomed into this kind of vortex of caring, of compassion, and part of that is them showing him compassion. Part of that is someone kind of like giving him like a nudge to kind of like look at the world a little differently. Part of that is seeing someone else in a worse situation than him, his neighbor Elena, and with a mom who's, somewhat abusive. I think it was just about like, it was almost like I was increasing like the stakes of the characters around him. And that's what was, so at first he's like meeting the delivery guy, and at first he's meeting, people in the park that he has a relationship with. And then by the end, he's really meeting someone who's suffering above him, whose husband's just passed away, and that felt like a really natural progression to kind of let the world like opening up more to you, showing you more. And Charles kind of, I don't know, like seeing his problems in context was the goal for me. How do I get to a place where his problems are fully in context and maybe not as bad as some of the people around him? Because I feel like that gives you perspective, more than anything, really. When you think your problems are bad, obviously seeing someone else who's suffering as much or more is like the best way to kind of, figure out that, your problems are survivable, are not the be all end all, basically. So trying to kind of get to that headspace was what we were trying to do.
And that idea of other characters opening up his perspective also comes into play in terms of his relationship with his ex. And so I wanted to ask you about the way in which you managed to really build her as a character. And we have some flashback moments throughout the film, but we don't see her fully on screen in present day until the very end. And we hear him talking about her, but it's interesting because it's actually the other characters are the ones that add the wider perspective and add these layers. You have a neighbor next door whose husband passed away. And so to her, she's like, well, these things that you think are a big deal or not, and have you thought about it this way? And right. So that actually evolves the way that we see what has happened in their relationship, what led to the breakdown of it. And I thought that was such an interesting way to build a character. So I just wanted to ask you about how you set that all up.
Yeah, the truth is, in retrospect, if like when I was writing it, Sonequa Martin Green is really like one of my favorite actors, and if I'd known she was going to be Isha, there'd be a lot more Isha in this film. It's funny, again, that goes back to like when I was writing the film. Initially, there's a version of this film where you don't meet her at all. There's no flashbacks. You never see her until she shows up with the keys. She's kind of this like almost mythological figure, just because I thought that was such an interesting way for keys to come back to Charles. So that's, again, a great example of getting way too hung up on the math or like the pivot, moment of a film. And truthfully, when you have someone like Sonequa in your film, I think ultimately the only question you should be asking is, well, how can I spend more time with Sonequa in this film? And I think, with that, I think the flashbacks, I think what that did was a couple of things. One is I wanted to see why Charles was so kind of like flustered by thinking about her. But I also wanted to show, I don't even know if it comes through in the film, but Brian and I talked a little bit about this. The way I viewed their relationship is that relationship that I like to think everyone's had at some point in their life, where you're with someone who you actually admire so much that you you almost feel like at some moment the other shoe's going to drop. Like they're too good for you. You think they're not, maybe, but you think they're too good for you. Who am I to deserve this person? And I think that's what I had to, I was thinking about it with regards to Charles, like both showing who she was, in her own dimensionality. I had so many fun talks with Sonequa about her background. I mean, I feel like there's a background of her that's missing in this film, and I'm so sad about it only because I just had so much fun talking to her about like, well, she's this kind of lawyer and she's coming from court, but she's going here. And unfortunately, there's only so much you can include to go back to our exposition line. But I really wanted to try to circle that point that Charles in some ways is like making this happen. He's not forgiving someone who really loves him, who made a mistake, that everyone makes a mistake. And like, because he's really getting lost in his worth versus her worth, to, again, all through his perspective. And so I think that's why you spend so much time with her at the end. Hopefully you get a lot more of her, like the feeling of who she is. And that also that, no matter how great she is, she's not someone who's going to be like waiting around forever. Like, she apologized, but it wasn't like she didn't kill anyone. So, it's really trying to kind of capture that element that she has her own kind of, sense of self too, and get that out there. It's hard to get all the pieces to fit together, just right. It's really, thank God for these great actors, basically.
I know making a film is no easy feat. And to that point, you came into making this as a first-time feature filmmaker, but with, an exponential amount of experience. You've made so many short films, you've made both narrative and documentary. And so you have such a great perspective as a filmmaker already coming into making this movie. And so I wanted to ask you though about, with all of that experience and knowing certain elements and what some of the challenges were going to be, what actually were the most unanticipated challenges that you ended up facing in the making of this film?
Man, good question. It's funny. I feel like I even have a list somewhere of like all the things I learned, making this film. I think probably the biggest ones are just how to prioritize your thinking going into production. I think that was something you can't really know until you do it. So I'm not mad at myself for not knowing, this or that. But like, for instance, we were talking about casting. Casting took 6 months. I mean, it took so long. It was definitely one of the longest parts of making this film. And I think I'm so happy with how it worked out. I love our casting director. I love our producers, like, because they really supported, like, thinking about the casting and the way we did. But I'd say, like, I would have thought about it differently if I'd known, oh, we're going to spend 6 months on casting. And you can't just kind of like, plug in actors. These are actors you're going to spend some time with on screen. And so you want them to be perfect, and you really have to consider each person. And so I think, I mean, some of what I'm saying isn't very profound, but I just mean that it's a really big deal to get the casting right. The other thing is, locations. It's kind of the same thing. It's just where you shoot the film is ultimately how the film is going to look. And so I think really the main thing I probably didn't foresee was how much time each thing takes in and of itself. And probably there's other things I probably did worry about, that I probably, you could just, your AD is going to take care of that. And I had a great AD. You're a cinematographer. She's going to take care of that. Don't worry about it. Like stuff like that I probably could have like been like, oh, cool. All right, great. You've got that. I'm going to work on these things that really, need my time. So it's really timing and prioritizing. I think that's something those, first-time directors should talk to other directors and be like, okay, what did you spend the most time on? Because I do think it's key. It's very key to get those things right. So.
No, I think that's really fantastic advice. And thank you so much for sharing all of that and talking about the film with us. Really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.